means getting the hang of this modeling thing. Yeah? Yeah? Well, I used to have 2 term papers. You need to take an assignment and you had to turn it into two term papers, which meant that you had to write it up as a report. You had to have an introduction, you had to have a discussion. So it's basically a fleshed out homework assignment. But students seem to be complaining about the amount of work in the class. Would you rather have had it as a term paper? Okay. Huh? Yeah. So the thing about a term paper is I used to have a lecture on how to present a paper, which means you have an introduction, you have an abstract and introduction, then you have a method section, then you have a presentation of the results and a discussion, and maybe a conclusion and some references. So it sort of gave you some training in writing papers. But the tyranny of the rating system. So in this class I always get rated on a bimodal distribution. Some students really like the class and some students hate the class. And because there's a group of students who want to take the class and there's a group of students who have to take the class. And I think among the group of students who have to take the class, there's a significant group who are very resentful, who always complain about the class. So I get wrapped on the knuckles for not getting the students to love me now. So as a result, we make things easier for you so you love us. Now you might not be aware that this is happening, but in fact it is. Let's see. Where's the spring for this? I guess it's trapped on the... Oh, there it is. When professors come up for promotion, if their ratings are not good enough, they get into trouble. Did you know that? So it's true. So you've got to be careful what you ask for. The students have asked for this class to be for me to scale down some of the material, so that's what I've done. But I still think it's a pretty demanding class. Do you find it demanding? Okay. So I think it's reasonable to drop those term papers. But, well, yeah, so I used to have, instead of 10 work sets, I'd have 8 work sets. And 2 of the work sets would be term papers. And then I reduced that to 1, and now I've reduced it to 0. And now the question is, should I reduce the number of work sets from 10 to 8 or something like that? You see, as I get older, I get less demanding. You find that younger professors are more demanding than older professors? Is that true? Okay. This is not working. Yeah. 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 They're all enthusiastic and they're going to make an impact and change the world. And that's how it should be. And some people are more successful than others at changing the world, but everybody, at least when you're young, should be full of energy and want to do that. So let's bring up today's lecture. There we are. Okay. So when you guys think this is a hard course, it could be worse. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about disease modeling. And disease modeling goes back to the 1910s when a biologist by the name of Sir Ronald Ross was very interested in modeling malaria. And so there were efforts to model diseases throughout the 20th century, but there was only a big push really starting in the 1980s when a scientist by the name of Robert May and Robert Anderson started working on models and really elaborated what is called this SIR framework, and it culminated in a book of theirs in 1990 on modeling disease. But they gave it the title Modeling Disease in Humans, where it really wasn't about modeling disease in humans. But I guess if they thought if they gave it that title, it would sell better, which it did. But it was really just generally about modeling. But since the 1980s, certainly beginning with the 1990s, people become more and more aware of the importance of disease, firstly as an ecological process. So ecologists first in the 1960s and 70s emphasized predation, competition, and also parasitism. But disease being caused by microbes, by viruses, bacterial particles, and small eukaryote organisms like malaria were very hard to see. Of course, some of them could be seen under the microscope, but viruses could not. And it's only with the advent of modern molecular biology and all the genetic work that huge progress could be made in understanding disease. And people could begin diagnosing disease and looking for the causes of disease. And I suppose one of the big impetuses to studying disease was the outbreak of the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the early 80s. So for several years in the early 80s, people were getting very ill and the cause wasn't known. And it was only around 1983-84 that people really began to identify the HIV virus. But then towards the end of the 1990s and starting at the beginning of this millennium, people became more aware of diseases and they started coining phrases like emerging disease. So they called HIV an emerging disease because it didn't seem to be around. The diseases, so what kind of diseases do we hear about going back 2,000 or 3,000 years, like in the Bible? Plague, yeah, okay, that's one. What else? Leprosy, that's another. So there's a disease related to leprosy, tuberculosis, that in the 19th century started killing a lot of people who lived in developing countries like Europe, where we're industrializing countries. When people began to live in higher concentrations, so disease became more important. When you live in low concentrations, a lot of diseases that are spread by human-to-human contact or host-to-host contact. So the individuals who have disease are infected by pathogens or parasites, and the individuals that are infected are called the hosts, and the organisms that cause the disease are the parasites. And you should distinguish between the disease and the agent that causes the disease. So for a long time, certain diseases like leprosy in biblical days, people were known to have leprosy. People didn't know what the source of that disease was. Malaria, people didn't know. Yellow fever. So in the 19th century, many of the causes of these diseases weren't known. And then slowly, people began to identify diseases that were caused by bacterial agents because you could grow them on plates and you could look at them under the microscope and you could see things like bacilli. So anthrax is a bacillus. It's a rod-shaped bacterial organism, and you can see those under an optical microscope. But viruses you can't see unless you image them using modern methods like electron microscopes and things like that. So disease modeling has become a big business in the modern society, as evidenced by the recent Ebola epidemic. People were trying to calculate what would happen, and I don't know if you remember, 2 months ago, people were claiming there were going to be over 1 million cases in Africa by February next year. Well, fortunately, that doesn't seem to be happening. But also, a lack of understanding of how the disease works got people to panic in the United States when there was absolutely no reason to panic. And as it turned out, nothing's really happening here, except for individuals that are coming back. They may be coming back infected, and the transmission here is hardly happening. I don't know. I think maybe there was one case of a local transmission here, but that's it. The transmissibility of disease depends on a number of different factors. So there are classes of disease that require host-to-host contact. And when we say host-to-host contact, it may be that certainly they're sexually transmitted diseases that require direct contact. There are other diseases which require you to be close to an individual, but not in physical contact. Like if somebody has a virus that causes influenza or a cold, they can sneeze in the room, and you can inhale it, or viruses can be deposited on surfaces like door handles. I don't know if you see some people open a door handle with the elbow now. So a lot of diseases get transmitted, like if you grab a door handle, there's something on it, and then you wipe your eye. You've got to think about how diseases enter the body. The skin is highly resistant to disease, and it's evolved to be that way because if the skin wasn't highly resistant, we'd all be getting disease all the time. There's a lot of bacteria out there. And so the mucosal membranes usually are a place of entry, or if you have open wounds where the disease can get into a cut. That's why if you have a cut or something, you treat it with an antibiotic ointment to kill the bacteria that are living on the skin. They can't really get inside unless it's in a cut. But then there are also diseases in the environment that you can pick up, so they go from the host to the environment back to the host. Can anybody think of a disease like that? So I have the disease, I deposit pathogens into the environment, and somebody picks it up from the environment, not directly from me. So malaria is like that, but malaria requires what we call a vector. So when it requires another organism to move it around, then we say it's transmitted by vectors. That's even more complicated. So there's host-to-host transmission, there's host to environment to host, and then host to a vector to a host. Yeah, so anthrax is something in the soil. And then what about waterborne diseases? So cholera is a great example of a disease that is just waiting to pounce if we don't practice sanitary conditions. Those are waterborne diseases. Something like anthrax makes... So anthrax has two forms. It has a vegetative cell form. When it gets into your body, it's in the form of a spore. Then it actually germinates from the spore, so it's like a seed breaking out of the seed shell. Then it starts to grow vegetatively, increasing rapidly. And what you have is this exponential growth. So we've seen how rapidly things can grow if they're growing exponentially. And then you get what is called bacteremia or viremia. When viruses are growing in your body or bacteria are growing in your body exponentially, then eventually you become filled with them. So that's what happens with Ebola. That's what happens with any of the diseases that when you finally succumb, become very sick, go into renal failure, or other organs are failing. It's because there's this huge load in your bloodstream and getting into lymph nodes and getting into different organs. Different diseases have different ways that they disable you. Now, that's the host perspective. From a disease perspective, what the disease needs to do is it needs to get from one host to another to keep going. If a disease is too virulent in that it kills the host rapidly before the host has an opportunity to transmit the disease, then that's a dead end for that strain of the disease. So what happens is that virulence is selected against, so that ultimately the pathogen wants to manage you in a way that can maximize the probability that it will be passed on by you to other individuals, or it'll be passed on by you to the soil. So anthrax needs to kill you, because in killing you, then you fall on the ground, carcass is opened by scavengers or whatever. Anthrax prevents your blood from clotting. It basically, a lot of pathogens kind of turn you into mush inside so that they can flow out, and they flow into the soil. And then anthrax, the vegetative cells will sporulate, and they'll form dense clusters of spores, and then animals that come around and eat the grass will pick it up. Anthrax is not a natural disease for humans. It's a disease of mammalian herbivores. The way we get anthrax is if you make it airborne. It's called inhalation anthrax. And it's hard to make it airborne because the spores just fall onto the ground, and they go into the ground. But if you put it on some kind of powder that will keep it suspended in the air, and then people go around and breathe it in, because it's going into the lungs is a very quick passage into your circulatory system to be picked up by the blood. Whereas if it goes through your gut, the pathogen has to solve all kinds of problems to make it through your gut and get into your system. It has to go to a highly acidic environment in your stomach and all sorts of things like that. So pathogens can become highly involved. But then, of course, viruses can find other ways to come into your gut and to go through your gut. And they go through mucosal membranes into the blood. So we're going to deal only with the very simplest of systems, and that's the ones where there's direct host-to-host transmission. And we're going to talk about how to model that. To talk about modeling a disease system which has to go into the environment and then back into the individual is more complicated. And to talk about something like malaria or West Nile virus that is vectored by something like a mosquito or Lyme disease that's vectored by a tick means that you not only have to model the host and the pathogen, but you also have to model the vector. And that's more complicated. And so we're going to talk about a group of models that are written down in the form of simple differential equations. And these are the so-called SIR models. And in the same way that we took a population of n individuals and we divide that population into different classes, and we talked about age classes or size classes, so now we're going to talk about disease classes. And in disease classes, you can have individuals that are infected, and we usually call them I, and individuals that are susceptible. And so the disease process is individuals that are susceptible becoming infected. Now, once they're infected, you can say, what then? What happens? There's certain kinds of, you wouldn't necessarily call this a disease, you call it a parasitic infection. Just switch this over. My wife hasn't learned yet that I teach this. I'm trying to train her. So, for example, lice at school. You get infected with some lice, and then eventually it spreads to everybody. So initially one individual has it, then several individuals have it, and if you don't get rid of it, then eventually everybody has it. And so that's a disease process, but that's for an external parasite like lice. There are disease processes where you'll get the disease, and then you might either die or recover. And you recover from a disease because your immune system kicks in and it fights the disease, and eventually it expels all the foreign organisms. So you can think of your immune system and the disease as two armies. But unfortunately, diseases are very diabolical in that they're armies that breed on the march. So not only do they have a certain number of individuals that will get into you, which is called the infectious dose that gets into you, which may be hundreds, thousands, millions, tens of millions of organisms, depending whether it's a virus or a bacteria. And then they start to spread out, and they try to keep multiplying and just overwhelm you through sheer numbers. But you have an immune system that has cells that attack these foreign invaders, but it takes time for your immune system to gear up. And if your body's never seen this organism, your immune system has to recognize what's going on, and it has to read the shapes of the different proteins associated with that organism, and it has to gear up and it has to make antibodies to attack the infection. So there's this war going on, and what happens is it starts out, and either you win or you lose. If you lose, you die, and if you win, you eventually get rid of the disease. Now, there are some diseases that are chronic, like tuberculosis, grow slowly within you, and your body might be able to isolate areas where it's growing, but it's growing inside you and eventually getting bigger and bigger. But there are others, like influenza or colds, caused by viruses, influenza virus or coronavirus, where your body will fight the disease, and if the immune system's strong and healthy, it can gear up fast enough and make enough cells and antibodies to neutralize and eventually shut down the disease process. So it starts to attack and destroy the disease organisms faster than they can replicate. And then what happens is you go to the R category, which can either be removed or it can also be recovered. If you're recovered, you might not be susceptible again, or you might be susceptible. You won't be susceptible if you get immunity. So, for example, in influenza or a cold, usually you have immunity. Something like smallpox, the immunity is lifelong. So you're in the recovered forever. However, in some diseases, like SIS, you go from S to I, and then when you recover, you might immediately become susceptible again. And that's a disease like gonorrhea. There's no immunity at all. There are also additional complications, and that is you might not go from S to I directly, but there's an intervening period which we call E, which is exposed, and you're not yet infectious, but you're going to become infectious. It's like in this Ebola outbreak, individuals had been infected, but they didn't have symptoms, and the common wisdom was that we have to wait at least 21 days to see if you're going to develop symptoms. So the E period is anything typically around a week. It could be as long as a couple of weeks, and to be safe that you're not going to get it, you can wait 21 days. In these models, you go from S to E to I to R, or you can go from S to E to I and back to S. Once you're in R, you can go back to S when you lose immunity. So, for example, influenza, if you get influenza this season, you're going to be immune to the local virus, so you're not going to get the same influenza infection twice within a season. And the following season, you may still have some immunity, but you may be slowly, your immunity may decay over time. And eventually, you might lose the immunity. But also what happens is the influenza strain that you're immune to may mutate to become a different strain, and you might not be immune to that. So it's a very complex process. We're not going to take any of these complexities into account. We're just going to do the basic modeling of what we call an SIR process. So here's a very simple model. So this is an SIR model of the seasonal spread of the common cold through a population of school children, and it divides the population into three possible states, S, I, and R. Now, the most important thing is to characterize the transmission process. So here we've got a transmission process that we call lambda. In some places it's called tau, but lambda is a function of both S and I, and there are different assumptions about it. So there's an assumption called the mass action assumption. And the mass action was like the most simple predation assumption. The rate at which you become infected is proportional to the number of encounters that S's make with I's. So every time an S meets an I, there's a certain probability that the I will transfer some of the pathogen to the S. And you can say this process is proportional to the density of S and I. So it's like individuals only meet one another at a rate that's proportional to density. And to some extent that happens. For example, if you live in a city and you go on the subway and you go in a crowded restaurant, you're more likely to come into contact with people and you're more likely to pick something up than if you live in a small rural area and you don't come into contact with as many people. That's called mass action. But there's another transmission process called frequency-dependent transmission.